Welcome to Barry's In the Interim podcast, where we explore the cutting edge of innovative clinical trial design for the pharmaceutical and medical industries, and so much more. Let's dive in.
All right, welcome everybody back to In the Interim. I'm your host, Scott Barry, and I have a really special guest, a cool guest with me today, Professor Craig Ritchie, who is the founder and CEO of Scottish Brain Sciences. He's also a professor of brain health and neurodegenerative diseases at the University of St. Andrews, formerly University of Edinburgh, and Craig will help if it's Edinburgh. I'm a U.S. person. Edinburgh. And interestingly, for today's discussion, he was the chief investigator of EPAD, and so that'll be one of our topics today. So welcome to In the Interim, Craig.
Thanks, Scott. It's delighted to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. So let's talk about, first let's jump into EPAD.
Sure.
So EPAD was the European Prevention of Alzheimer's Dementia, an IMI-funded project from 2015 to 2020. For full disclosure, Barry Consultants and I personally was involved in EPAD in the statistical engine room, as we referred to it, on trial design. So tell me a little bit about, introduce to our audience EPAD.
Sure. So yeah, I think there's lots of ways I could introduce the project, but I think that the most important was that it was trying to really address a major problem that we had then, to a fair degree we still have, and that is to really accelerate the development of new therapies for Alzheimer's disease. And there was a whole bunch of reasons back in 2015 when we started the project that we felt there was challenges in developing new therapies. And EPAD was a hugely ambitious project that really did, in many ways, tried to boil the ocean. You know, we wanted to look at recruitment, we wanted to look at early detection of the disease, we wanted to look at new trial designs, which of course you were intimately involved with. And huge program of research across Europe and with partners all over the world. Just to give it a sense of scale, I think at one point there were over 400 people working on the project. It was a 64 million euro funded program, and 39 partners from pharmaceutical companies, small and medium enterprises, as well as major academic institutions across Europe. So yeah, a huge program, and like I said, trying to really help develop more rapidly better therapies for Alzheimer's disease.
Okay, so there in my view, and you'll help me with this, but two major parts to this, two major innovations. One was the intent to build a platform trial, have a common master protocol, a platform trial, bring multiple therapies on, can share the infrastructure, share control arms, accelerate development. That was a huge part of the project. The second was the readiness cohort, which we're involved in a number of platform trials, and we'll sort of get to that in this sort of before 2020 platform trial, and then COVID hit, and what we understood about platform trials after this, and the weird place EPAD was. But the readiness cohort is something I've never seen in a platform trial. Yeah. So explain the readiness cohort and its relationship. I know it has a huge amount of scientific benefit outside of the platform trial, but why is it called a readiness cohort?
Yeah, I mean, it one of the major problems that we had, and I think it's probably true of a lot of clinical trials in a lot of clinical areas, was how long it takes to identify people who are eligible for the trial. And that's often the case because, you know, a trial starts, the sponsor, you know, creates the inclusion-exclusion criteria, they fire the gun, and it's as if it's the first trial that's ever been done. And you're starting every time you do a new trial, it's like you're starting from baseline again. So the readiness cohort was a very good program that created readiness. You had thousands of research participants who were ready to be involved in a clinical trial, and their readiness was probably in some ways across two sort of main dimensions, if you like. Number one was they, as people, were ready. So when they were consented into the cohort study, it was very much, this is the intention of the cohort study is, if you're eligible and you're willing to participate, there could and should be a drug trial for you at some point in the not too distant future. So they were adjusted, they were psychologically ready, they were committed to being in a drug trial. And then the other element of readiness was we knew a lot about these participants. We knew their amyloid status, we knew their cognitive status, we knew their medical comorbidities, so that when the trial started, or when the trial would have started, we would have a very low screen failure rate, because we weren't, again, just going to the community and hoping we picked up a bunch of people with Alzheimer's pathology or particular range. So that was the two major dimensions of readiness. But like you said, Scott, there was other things came out of that data set that we were collecting, which are been actually transformative in terms of our understanding of early disease. Because one of the key things, like you said at the beginning, this was the European Prevention of Alzheimer's Dementia. So nobody in that cohort had a dementia syndrome at baseline. These were people who were maybe at high risk of developing the dementia syndrome, but didn't actually have it. So this was very much about the earliest stage of the disease and exactly where people, I think, want to be treated, before the symptoms start to emerge.
Okay, and the scale of this this cohort. So these are individuals, I think it was 50 and older, that may have risk factors. They don't have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. There's some level of risk at it. I think at some point there were 2,000 patients as part of this, and participants as part of this cohort, 30 centers around Europe, where longitudinally you follow the participants in the cohort. And one role of this is when there's a drug in the platform trial, you can now go to these participants. You know so much about them that the screen failure rate at that point may be very, very low.
Yeah.
Contrasted to if a sponsor goes out and they want to find participants that have a pathological amyloid or biomarkers consistent with the cognitive part, they may get 90% screen failure. And there's huge cost in this. So this was a huge advance for companies that wanted to come into the platform. And largely this was incredibly successful. So the readiness cohort was incredibly successful.
Yeah, I mean, it was incredible. And I think what we did was in the first year of the program was bring together investigators, companies, sponsors, mainly their sort of R&D divisions, and set out the framework for the program. But also there was a lot of hearts and minds that we were winning about the need for this in the area that we were all committed to, namely the Alzheimer's space. It was in many ways a hugely successful project, not just for developing that cohort study, which I think is the largest collection of data and participants still to date, with the depth and the level of phenotyping. One thing we didn't mention was, of course, that everybody, for instance, had spinal fluid taken and all very detailed brain imaging. So there were certainly elements of this which were necessary for finding people for trials, but we also had this kind of secondary objective of, really trying to understand the upstream disease mechanisms that drive Alzheimer's disease, and with a view eventually, I guess, to going even further upstream with interventions and precision medicine, ultimately, around particular individuals, particular profiles of disease well before symptoms develop. So, and a lot of the objectives of EPAD, if you like, have survived into a lot of programs today. Because I think the gang we had together of academics and industry folks was second to none globally. Yeah. I mean, there was just the thought leaders, the passion that was in the program, the early career researchers. It was incredible legacy that project's had moving forward.
One thing I remember, and it's I think it's become more common now, 10 years after, But it was one of the first times I was really involved where the participants were such an important part of the design of the cohort. They were there at meetings and had a huge impact in the research. And it was really my first experience of that.
Yeah, and it was actually interesting that when we got the original brief from IMI, the Medicine Initiative, I don't know how much people know about those programs, but they're more like a tender. There's actually an objective that's set out by industry, by European Union through the Innovative Medicines Initiative. And I remember one of the things that we added into the original tender was an additional work package 8, which was ethics, legal and social implications. Because we did consider that having this approach, which was novel, people probably still think about Alzheimer's as an older person's disease. It affects, people, dare say, about to, have problems with driving or day-to-day living. And we, of course, as investigators and as companies thought, this is a midlife disease and this is something that, affects people before symptoms develop. So we also had to give a lot of consideration to the narrative around what we were doing. So like you said, we had a system in place where we had participant panels at a site level, at a national level, at an international level. We had lots of press releases with participants who'd been involved. So we've actually, as you may recall, we've actually published some papers on research participants being involved in design and delivery of the program. So that was a huge, at that stage, quite innovative, particularly with this population.
Yeah. Okay. So now the role of the readiness cohort for a platform trial. So we built a platform trial. We built a protocol. We went to EMA. We got advice. We built it so that a particular drug could come on board. It would be an appendix within the master protocol. Multiple drugs could come on board. There's a readiness cohort. So now the ability to enroll participants who are ready, the phenotype, the knowledge of these patients. The trial's built. And looking back, we never enrolled an arm in the platform trial.
Correct.
To some extent, that part was a failure of EPAD. EPAD had a number of huge successes and learnings, disease learnings, I'm sure, that are still coming today. But it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Why didn't it happen?
Well,
I have thoughts, you have thoughts. Why didn't it happen?
So I think the... when I reflect on this at a personal level, and people often counsel me against this, I do say that EPAD was a great success against many different sort of parameters, but it ultimately failed because the objective, the number one objective of EPAD was to set up a platform trial. So all the other adjacencies, the cohort study, we had this EPAD Academy of early career researchers, we had a participant panel, we had the disease modeling, etc. Ultimately, this didn't meet its primary objective, and I think the reasons for that, and I think we've obviously reflected on this since 2020, were that I think it was a big leap, if I can be candid, for a lot of the sponsors to say we trust this platform for how we're going to develop our new therapy, because in many ways we were asking companies to put in their prized asset, particularly a biotech, for instance, or even a big pharma, to outsource this in a sense to a third party to run the study. And I think if you and I have talked about this a lot, obviously, over the years, I think if we could have our time again, it may have been useful to put in a repurposed drug as a proof of platform, because I think once we had the data that showed the platform worked, the readiness cohort recruited well, then I think this would have created the momentum and the assurance that I think people upstairs in these drug companies that we weren't necessarily talking to directly would have had. That they said, yeah, let's go for it. We were also a little bit unlucky that there were a couple of companies, and I probably shouldn't say who they were because I'm pretty sure it's confidential, but who were very committed, but they actually had problems with phase 1 with toxicity and other things. So we seem to have a series of issues that seem to work against us to actually get a drug in. But I mean, fundamentally, I think a lot of people did. This is actually the way forward. And of course, 2020 hit, COVID happened, and I think a lot of momentum behind the project got lost a little bit. I think if COVID hadn't hit and we hadn't lost that couple of years, then I think we would probably dusted ourselves down, regrouped, and gone again a lot more quickly. But as you know, I'm trying to re-engineer these things again.
Yep. Yep. So we'll come to that. So there's this idea that a pharmaceutical company has a compound, and I think we saw examples, and we won't mention any names, where they saw we could go into this platform trial that hasn't enrolled a patient yet and largely would be run by CRO, they'd be giving their baby to somebody else to run it, but the numbers lined up well, the screen failure, the cost, the numbers, but it was that sort of leap when the trial hadn't enrolled a patient yet. I'll contrast this a little bit with the Healy ALS platform trial, where one of the beauties of that, very similar trial design, the Ice Bucket Challenge raised money that they were able to fund the first few drugs into the platform.
Exactly. Yeah.
And once they got the first few in and they could show this is what happens, we're getting great data, we're enrolling patients, everybody was lining up to enter. There's a little bit of that first arm tipping point thing. And so this idea in all platform trials now, the same thing in EPAD happened in a Duchenne muscular dystrophy trial. They were doing the same thing. No company would be the first. Yeah. This idea of a loss leader or a repurposed drug, something to show proof of concept, I think is really critical to these platform trials.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges we faced, and again, this is, I mean, it might sound like very fine grain and very sort of, governance operational, if you like, but IMI projects are, like I said at the beginning, they're almost like a tender, where you have to pretty much commit to right out of the gate, beginning of the project, these are our work packages, these are our deliverables, et cetera, and actually flexing the program in life is really, really hard, if not impossible. Yeah. So if we wanted to repurpose some of they're saying we wanted to move some funding to actually have a repurposed medicine, that was really not really open to us as an opportunity. So even though we kind of thought, this would be probably a sensible thing to do, there wasn't really the mechanism within the trial or within the program to be able to do that. And I think the other thing, and it sounds again very detailed, but the way we were going to sustain the platform was to do the trials. So the money was going to start flowing back into the system because the sponsors would pay for a trial and that would maintain the cohort study, et cetera. So without that trial, then there was no sustainability because the grant finished after 5 years. And, again, I often, as you know, Scott, I've come into the business world and you could almost argue there's a 64 million euro investment, but at the end of the 5 years, it just disappears.
Yeah.
I actually think for all that seed funding, or even, it's almost like a little bit of a Series A, you think there maybe could and should have been a mechanism that didn't rely just on the program for sustainability, but actually said, we've made a big investment in this, let's throw some good money after good. But that, again, wasn't an option for IMI or any other sponsor. So we were left where we were.
I think it was also a really interesting time in the science of a platform trial. There were several out there. There was iSpy 2 out there, Stampede trials, several trials. But it was a really oddity that maybe a perceived risk for pharma to go into this new odd thing. Would regulators really trust data from it? Then COVID happened, and really the only way to address COVID was platform trials.
Exactly.
The recovery trial, the REMAP-CAP trial, active, Operation Warp Speed. The science of platform trials in 5 years from COVID to where we are now, it was incredible acceleration of it, that if we started EPAD now, I think it would have been a very different perception of it. I think we'd go about it differently with our lessons learned. But the industry itself and its understanding of the platform trial, I also think would have been very different after COVID.
Well, definitely, it's slightly ironic, isn't it, that COVID was probably was in a sense the nail in the coffin for EPAD, but it was the real proving ground for platform trials. Yeah. So but I guess that's why like I said, we're dusting ourselves off and we're trying to go again.
Yeah. So dusting ourselves off. now after 2020.
Yeah.
You're the founder of Scottish Brain Sciences.
Yeah.
What is Scottish Brain Sciences?
So, I think, so I set up this company about maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and there was a variety of different reasons for it. But I think the most important was that at a personal level, through I'm a clinical academic, I'm a trained psychiatrist, graduated way back in 91, worked at UCL, Imperial, Melbourne, various, academic institutions. And I was fortunate enough to be involved in some, like with EPAD and other programs, cutting edge science, and really learning so much about what was possible in terms of our understanding of neurodegenerative diseases, early detection. We've got blood-based biomarkers now, we've got incredible imaging technologies, all these wonderful things happening, new therapies being developed. But that world was a million miles away from my clinic. So when I actually went to clinic on a Tuesday afternoon in Edinburgh, it was almost like the clinic that I helped to set up in 1997 in Melbourne, Australia. So although the science had been advancing at an incredible rate, clinical services were actually getting further away from the science. And there's very few branches of medicine where that gap is actually widening. I know there's always been delays between science and implementation, but I was really sensing that we were actually getting worse rather than better. And maybe even COVID played a part in that. We all had the experiences of what happened to people with dementia during the pandemic. So I thought, what am I now? So I was 54 years old, 54 years old, and I said, almost like a final roll of the dice, rather than trying to continue to do this through the academic and the public sort of sector, I thought I'll start up a company to try and bridge that translational gap. And that's what Scottish Brain Sciences is. So for people inside who knew what EPAD is, I've actually tried to commercialize EPAD, but doing it through my own company. So you're not relying on multiple other stakeholders, but actually saying, let's bring all this in-house to try and develop the assets in some ways that we had within EPAD, but doing it through a commercial vehicle.
Yeah. So now you're setting up sites across Scotland, across Europe. I think you're physically right now, as we look at you, you're in the U.S.
Yeah, in the US.
So you're setting up almost this readiness cohort?
Well, we've set it up. So we have a cohort called IONA. IONA's IONA, but it's a Scottish island, a beautiful Scottish island off the west coast of Scotland. That is the readiness cohort. And maybe have shared the protocol with you, Scott. If I haven't, when you look at it, you'll say, that looks vaguely familiar. Because it does look a little bit like EPAD for a variety of different reasons. And that's the cornerstone or the foundation of everything we're doing in the company is that IONA longitudinal cohort study. Yeah. And it has all the same, potential outcomes that we've talked about, using the data, using the biobank for discovery, but also using the cohort study as a readiness cohort for putting people into trials. And our experience in Scotland, where we've been running this for maybe a year and a half, is it works. It really does work in terms of engaging people and getting people into trials at unprecedented levels than we've seen historically.
Does that, jumping back to this idea that you felt like the clinical side was 1997 and it was divorced a little bit, do you think that bringing this and bringing these cohorts and patients in readiness is helping part of that problem in addition to this, that you're improving patients?
I think one of the things also that we learned from EPAD was, I mentioned Work Package 8, which was the ethics, legal, and social implications. You also remember we had Work Package 6, which was communication and engagement. Yeah. And that, again, for people working inside the space, recognizing that you needed to, in inverted commas, change the narrative was really important. Getting people to understand that, and the people can be the public, but can also be fellow clinicians, that this is a midlife disease that expresses itself late as a dementia syndrome. You needed to keep banging that drum. You needed to keep getting that message out there through various channels. So the readiness cohort in Scottish Brain Sciences, is the kind of, again, the foundation, the empirical basis for Anna Borthwick, who was in charge of Work Package 6 in EPAD, now works for Scottish Brain Sciences. So that part of the company is absolutely crucial. To use that patient voice or the participant voice to channel that, to do engagement work, to make people realize that there is real hope and expectation that we can eventually cure these conditions. So I think, as well as the data, there's also, like I say, as well as the numbers, there's also the narrative. And I think that's something we're committed to also developing.
So our participants in your readiness cohort in Scottish Brain Sciences, you're using these for pharmaceutical clinical trials. This is now an access point. Yeah, okay.
But I think one of the things that, was really quite gratifying in many ways was that when I remember at the beginning I said that the readiness was based on two things. That yes, it was the data and the characteristics, but there was also the readiness of the individual person. And I remember, it's quite sort of poignant moment, Scott, but I remember the first participant from the IONA cohort, I actually took consent to come into a trial. And it was completely different from any other consent I'd previously done, because she'd been part of the cohort study, she'd been up to the unit, she knew my research staff, they knew her, there was this engagement. She was, virtually, it was like, where do I sign?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for offering me this opportunity. And it just made me realize that EPAD would have worked from that level. Yeah. The engagement we had from participants, research participants, had we gone back to them with the platform trial, I think there'd have been a gratitude that we were putting in place the trial. So it was a bit of a bittersweet moment, to be honest.
Yep. Now, another interesting part of this is when EPAD started, we were probably in the midst of, I don't remember exactly the number, but 20 plus failed phase 3 trials. Nothing worked in Alzheimer's disease. Lots of reasons for it. Drugs, understanding the patient, do they actually have Alzheimer's? Lots of things, the stage of disease and all that. Now we're at a point where we've had some successful disease-modifying treatments. We have regulatory approval of them. Must be gratifying from that perspective in terms of treatments. But now, where do we sit today in terms of drug development altering this disease? Are you optimistic of where we sit today?
Oh, I'm eternally optimistic. I think we understand this disease. We're beating it. We're getting to understand lots of disease pathways and mechanisms from the laboratory work and from the data. It's translating that into therapeutic interventions is the critical thing. And I still think we have a problem because the clinical trials ecosystem, if you like, in the Alzheimer's space is still 20th century. So these trials still cost a fortune to actually run. So the bar to actually embarking upon a phase 3 clinical trial is incredibly high. And I think one of the things that we haven't really talked about is, but we kind of ran the numbers on EPAD and thought that the cost of delivering a trial to the sponsor would be quite significantly lower than it would have been had they just done it on their own. So I think, again, the science isn't the problem. I've been saying that for years. I think the problem is actually operational and sort of more sort of practical aspects. And that hasn't changed. And I still think there's still a little bit of a copy and paste in trial design today from trials we used to do in the 20th century. Well, like you've mentioned, other areas like MS and MND and cancer has moved on. But we're still a little bit stuck.
Yeah. So within that Alzheimer's space, part of it is, will a platform trial, you mentioned the huge cost. So if somebody wants to go in and run a trial, phase 2, phase 3, this huge cost, the platform trial could create cheaper shots on goal, more shots on goal, accelerate the ecosystem as you described. I also think that Alzheimer's is probably, given the enormous burden that Alzheimer's places on healthcare systems, that a platform trial at the payer level, at the healthcare system, to understand who, when for these treatments are right is saves huge amount of money for that's also a potential, a little bit different than drug development, but one at a understanding the various drugs that come out and are approved to some level could be enormously impactful.
And I think one of the things that we saw in EPAD was, of course, the research centres who are running the trials, whether it's in Amsterdam or in Stockholm or indeed in Edinburgh, maybe less than Edinburgh than other parts, to be honest, but they were also clinics. So there was this kind of adjacency between clinical research and clinical practice. So I think to the point you're making, that when you're running clinical research, it's a shorter gap. If the trial works, if the drug becomes available, you're the investigator who becomes the doctor. Your research staff become the nurses and the doctors that give the infusions and monitor for safety. So I think this ecosystem that we develop in a research setting needs to also be the ecosystem where people get treated. So the trial participant becomes the patient, hopefully quite seamlessly. And again, that's something that Scottish Brain Sciences we're trying to do. We're trying to deliberately blur the boundary between clinical research and clinical practice. The payer, of course, like you say, should be biting your hand off, because what you're actually doing is you're much better at patient selection. You're much better at ensuring that you have the data to hand that says is the drug working or not working. So like in a trial, we wanted to fail fast. We wanted to kill arms. We wanted to look at things that were working and promote them, and look at other things that weren't working and maybe, like I say, make that go, no-go decision. The evolutionary analysis, as we called it. And I think that's true in clinical practice. Is this drug working for my patient? If not, let's try something else. But I think at the moment, in clinical practice in the Alzheimer's space, it's kind of a one-size-fits-all, and we don't have that kind of approach that, as I keep saying, other branches of medicine do, like in oncology or HIV medicine. We don't have that repertoire or that portfolio of medicines and tests to really understand what's going on with somebody.
So you talked a lot about the benefit of the translation from the research to the patient. The other part that just seems so awkward looking at the outside in is we learn about what works from less than 1% of patients with a syndrome, with a disease. The more that we could tie together and fuse clinical practice and research, and we learn from patients that are treated every day, there's an explosion in learning if we could learn from people taking treatments outside of research, what we call traditional research.
Yeah, and I think there's we're talking earlier about the therapies that have actually made it through the FDA and the EMA and the MHRA, namely donanemab and lecanemab. And there's attempts, dare I say it, to put in place phase 4 trials, to put a post-marketing kind of data collection. And if I can be candid, I don't think those things should have probably been designed 3 years before launch, because I think we're not really making that seamless transition to, from phase 3 to phase 4. I think everybody knew that when these drugs, with the side effects and the issues and the challenges that we face in using them, because it's so different from what we used before, it should have been a seamless phase 3, phase 4 program that people were up at. But we've probably lost 2 or 3 years in terms of setting up phase 4. Now, again, I'm not saying that SBS is a solution to everything, but if we do have people who either go into a trial or go onto a treatment, they stay in the IONA cohort. So we continue to collect that data, whether they're on a trial or on a treatment. And, as long as the company survives, we should be able to develop that longitudinal data set, follow the person on their entire journey, plus or minus drug, plus or minus trial. And that data would be obviously incredibly important. And then there's the real world data for people that needs to be collected as well outside of that. But I still think that a lot of that real world data that we have in memory clinics around the world isn't necessarily collecting the data that we really need to understand the issue. It's a little bit lacking in veracity from what we actually need.
Well, this is awesome. It sounds like incredible stuff going on. You're jetting around the world setting this up. I remember back in EPAD, with maybe a late night discussion and a drink, you pushed on me the importance of sleep for Alzheimer's, for health. Are you sleeping well, Craig?
I'm sleeping a lot better. Thank you.
Okay.
I think, you got to practice what you preach, and I think that's a really important point. By the way, I mean, I know we're coming to a close, but we've talked about drugs, we've talked about biology, but there are so many things at a lifestyle level, managing sleep, managing diet, managing exercise, these types of things, which will probably give you the best shot of maybe never getting Alzheimer's pathology. Yeah. And if you do, you mitigate some of those risks. So, let's not just focus on the drugs. I mean, Mia Kivipalto, as you know, our good friend, is leading in that with the finger study. So I think, wrapping around the non-pharmacological, the lifestyle with the pharmacological is ultimately the best solution. And yes, I'm sleeping a bit better. Thank you. Are you?
I actually am. Yes, I've made it a priority. I've made it a priority for my health. Yes. I also remember as what was on your music device. I don't know if it was an iPod. I don't remember at the time, but you were an Eric Church Springsteen fan.
I still am. Yeah.
I remember one of the best sort of lines from that, which probably appeals to somebody in a psychiatrist, and is funny how a melody sounds like a memory, which
it's
seems
beautiful,
like
isn't it? Yeah.
Which seems very apropos. So,
I think
Craig.
Good place to finish. I'm going to put that onto my Spotify now. I'll revisit that.
So wonderful. I thank you immensely for joining. This was fun. Appreciate it. Thank you, Craig.
Pleasure. Thanks, Scott.